Just like people, empires are born, they grow, they mature, they get old, and they die. And it's always a curious research to see what led to their collapse. People usually like to discuss major battles that decided history, and they like to speculate what could have, would have, might have happened if a certain emperor had given the just right order and won a certain battle. However, no empire collapses because of a lost battle. The empires collapse because the institutions and the socio-economic factors that made these empires start to disappear. More often than not, you can trace these trends hundreds of years before the collapse actually happens. And the Ottoman Empire was no different. The empire was built on two systems, the Sipahis and the Janissaries. And it was the disruption of these two systems in the 17th century that led the Ottomans on their path to decline. But before we get to the video, please subscribe and leave a like. Enjoy! In 14th century, Ottomans ushered in a new era for the Middle East and Europe. It was the era of centralized modern empires. Compared to its feudal counterparts, which depended on the whims of the feudal lords, the Ottoman state could raise more taxes, levy more troops, and afford the expensive professional armies and wars. This meant that the Ottoman armies performed better in the battlefield tactically and strategically. Ottomans achieved this through the Sipahis and the Janissaries. In the Middle Ages, kings and sultans governed through wealthy nobles that owned large portions of the realm. During times of war, these nobles would gather their private armies from their lands and join the king's army. The problem with this system was that the wealthy nobility held most of the power, and the nobles were just as likely to fight each other and their king as the enemy. The Ottomans through Sipahis bypassed the nobility. Sipahis functioned similarly to the nobles in that they governed their lands, cultivated it, sent tax revenue to the sultan, and used the excess income from the estate to raise troops for war. When called for war, they would show up and join the sultan's army. Except the Sipahis could not own, expand, or sell their land. It was more like a permanent lease from the state as compensation for their service. Once their service was over, another Sipahi would take over the land. These regulations limited individual Sipahis from gathering too much power and prevented the formation of a powerful aristocratic class. The Sipahi system meant that instead of relying on the nobility for tax revenue and troops, the Ottoman sultans would directly get these from the Sipahis. And the centralized system was topped by the Janissaries, a central professional army that was more than enough to quell any internal opposition to the central government. This is what the Ottoman army looked like at its peak in 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. Professional Janissaries and heavy Kapıkulu cavalry in the center. Semi-professional provincial armies made of landed Sipahis on the flanks, supported by irregular Turkic raiders, light Azabs, and a healthy portion of Crimean nomadic cavalry. The Janissaries especially were true professional soldiers. They trained and drilled together, and they were always loyal to the Sultan with a clear chain of command. This meant that the Ottoman armies could execute complicated maneuvers, meanwhile the feudal armies they faced could easily fall in disarray. And on top of everything, the Ottoman state was saving a lot of coin, as the Sipahis were not paid in gold, but with land. The system was great, but if that was so, then why did it collapse in the 17th century? Well, it had one great limitation. the size of the army was limited by the size of the empire, as there was only so much land to give away to the Sipahis. Since the soldiers were paid in land, the empire could not temporarily recruit more troops when needed. Whatever the system could accommodate during peacetime was whatever the empire could mobilize for war. And the only way to expand the army was through the expansion of the empire. This is where the problems started appearing for the empire. In late 16th century, the conquests came to a halt. It was no longer the 15th century where the Ottomans enjoyed being the only centralized empire that had access to gunpowder weapons. In the east, the conquests were stopped by the similarly powerful Safavid Persia, and in the west, the wars had changed with the advancements in fortifications. Now, wars consisted of a series of sieges and counter-sieges of minor border fortifications. And this type of warfare was much costlier than the pitched battles of the previous centuries. In a field battle, even a defeat would usually only result in several thousand dead only. Meanwhile, even a victory in a siege would be a grueling affair, with thousands dead in the trenches and on the walls. Ottomans had conquered entire Hungary with 1,000 or so casualties in 16th century. Meanwhile, in 17th century, similar casualties could be suffered for a nameless border fortification. Suddenly, the empire was losing 10 times more men in its wars. On the other hand, the army sizes had increased drastically compared to the 14th and 15th centuries. In early 15th century, an Ottoman army of 40,000 was a massive army, which could only be matched by crusader coalitions. Fast forward to 17th century, a 40,000 strong army was a relatively small one, as armies could now easily reach hundreds of thousands. The average Ottoman army in 15th century was around 20 to 60,000 strong. Meanwhile, in 17th century, this had more than doubled to 60 to 120,000, and the system had started overheating. In 15th century, the empire needed a total manpower pool of around 60 to 70,000, counting the reserves, and the Ottoman state could likely raise 100 to 150,000. Meanwhile, in 17th century, the need had grown to 250,000 to cover for the Persian, Austrian, Russian, and African fronts. Meanwhile, the capacity of the system mostly remained unchanged. Ottoman Empire in 17th century was short almost 100,000 men. So, how did the Ottomans wage war in the 17th century then? They came up with a band-aid solution. Instead of solving the systemic problem, they opened the imperial coffers and hired peasant mercenaries from Anatolia. These troops were called Sekban. They varied greatly when it came to their training and battle prowess. They were a clear step down from the earlier provincial armies. But their main problem became apparent during peacetime. After a war was over, these Sekban brigades would be disbanded to save coin. However, the problem was that once disbanded, you had massive numbers of unemployed men, armed and battle-tested, all concentrated in the province of Anatolia. And as hungry men with guns would do, they revolted and started plundering the riches of the Anatolia and even Levant. These revolts were called Jalali revolts, and these revolts put the nail in the coffin for the Ottoman administrative system. Anatolia was completely ravaged and depopulated, and the Sipahi system collapsed. To emphasize, Sipahis were not only soldiers, they were also the taxpayers of the empire. And with them, tax money was also gone. To make up for the lost tax revenue, the empire sold large fiefdoms to wealthy elites. And that was the end of the Sipahis. Sekbans remained as the backbone of the Ottoman army in 17th and 18th centuries. Meanwhile, the economic function of the Sipahis was filled by a new feudal elite called the Ayans. On the other hand, the other pillar of the Ottoman state, the Janissaries, were in decline as well. The devshirme system, which was the conscription of Christian boys, was insufficient for the size of the modern wars. During the empire's height in early 16th century, there were 10,000 Janissaries. In mid-16th century, 13,000, and in early 18th century, 120,000. There simply wasn't enough recruits coming from the devshirme system to cover for this many soldiers. So, if the devshirme system was insufficient, how did the empire increase Janissary numbers by so much? Simple, by bloating the system. Janissaries were supposed to be conscripted from the Balkans as children, vigorously trained and well equipped. But the state could not conscript and train so many boys, nor could it afford to equip so many elite troops. So they started admitting anyone as a janissary. They dropped their standards. By the end, in 19th century, janissaries were nothing more than an armed mob, corrupt to the core and no better at fighting than a peasant with a gun. The Ottoman Empire never recovered from the collapse of the Tamarli Sipahi and Janissary institutions. When these institutions became dysfunctional, they were disbanded and replaced with short-sighted band-aid solutions. Sipahi system was eventually replaced with Ayans and their private armies. These were large and wealthy landlords. This terrible decision led to the Ottoman Empire practically becoming a feudal state in 19th century. Ottoman Empire thus spent the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries always playing catch-up, replacing one band-aid system with another, which eventually led to the end of the empire. Now, the Ottomans had many other major issues such as lack of industrialization and its multi-ethnic composition. However, it was the collapse of the Sipahi and Janissary institutions that made the empire incapable of reacting to its real issues. Thank you for watching. If you have liked it, please subscribe and leave a like, and I will see you in the next one.